The term post-truth has entered the American lexicon in the past decade or so, and has largely been used in the political context. It is almost always a pejorative which is meant to describe a figure who is resolute in speaking half-truths, embellishments, or outright lies. While the idea of a lying politician is certainly nothing new, the distinctive aspect of a post-truth figure is their willingness to persist in their untruths, even when they're proven wrong. A post-truth figure simply does not acknowledge any facts which refute their position, or which might be problematic for it. If presented with this counter-evidence, they may simply deflect, or call it false, or impugn the source of the evidence, make ad hominem attacks, or any number of tactics. The goal of this strategy is to redefine the truth almost by sheer force of will or obtuseness. The truth is no longer what the facts say because I do not accept those facts. The truth is what I say is the truth. The office of the White House press secretary, or really any spokesperson for a government bureau in America, provides a great example for a fundamentally post-truth archetype. This is independent of party. The press secretary does not succeed or fail at their job according to whether their words are the verifiable truth, either in the objective sense of matching the available evidence or in the institutional sense of according with expert opinion. And the press secretary also wouldn't be very good at their job if they bowed to public opinion either. In fact, the very point of that office is to shape public opinion. The press secretary's job is to frame the facts on the ground in the most favorable possible light for the administration, usually with consideration to the perspective of their political base, but if possible, the position should look favorable to all Americans. Whether one succeeds or fails at this has absolutely nothing to do with the truth, and this could really be said about the entire field of public relations, including the public statements made by private firms whenever they address their own controversies. Therefore, while post-truth may be a new term, signifying this resoluteness and falsehood and distinguishing it from garden-variety lying, we must also recognize that the term is the only thing that's new, not the phenomenon itself. Those familiar with the British filmmaker Adam Curtis probably know the term hypernormalization from his documentary of that name. This was a term used by Alexei Yurchak to describe the social condition of the late Soviet Union. As Curtis puts it, everyone in the society knew that what the party said was not true, and the party knew that everyone in the society knew that what they said was not true. The Soviet Union was not flourishing economically. They were not proceeding closer and closer toward the communist ideal. Rather, their centrally planned economy was coming apart at the seams. And yet, the party leaders persisted in the traditional rhetoric, knowing it was ineffective. They created, as Curtis puts it, a fake world. This hypernormality, this fake world, persists not in spite of the fact that the leaders know their lies are not believed, but in part because of it. It is a subtle message of the regime's power to the populace. The truth is not what the facts say. The truth is what we say. But why does this work? How is it that human society could be structured in such a way that lies can persist if they have power behind them? Aren't humans supposed to be rational animals? How could we tolerate this state of affairs? How could it ever arise? And supposing that it is the case that post-truth figures will gain power, what are we supposed to do in response to that situation? Make rousing speeches about the importance of truth? Force everyone to learn critical thinking in the state-run education system? Have faith that the arc of history bends toward truth just as it bends toward justice? All of this has been tried before, and I'll leave it up to you, dear viewer, to make your own determination as to whether any of that works. So you might ask at this point what any of this has to do with the philosophy of the 19th century German pessimist Arthur Schopenhauer. In the preliminary section of Arthur Schopenhauer's essay, The Art of Being Right, also known as The Art of Controversy or The Art of Heuristics, he provides a guidebook to arguing. In this guide, he lists 38 different tactics for winning arguments. He tells us outright in the preliminary section that these tactics do not aim to establish the validity of claims through logic. In fact, he argues that dialogue between two or more individuals, is a separate activity from logic, the pursuit of truth. Schopenhauer writes in the preliminary, quote, "We must always keep the subject of one branch of knowledge quite distinct from that of any other. To form a clear idea of the province of dialectic, we must pay no attention to objective truth, which is an affair of logic. We must regard it simply as the art of getting the best of it in a dispute, which is all the easier if we are actually in the right. In itself, dialectic has nothing to do but to show how a man may defend himself against attacks of every kind, and especially against dishonest attacks. And in the same fashion, how he may attack another man's statement without contradicting himself, or generally without being defeated. The discovery of objective truth must be separated from the art of winning acceptance for propositions. For objective truth is an entirely different matter. It is the business of sound judgment, reflection, and experience for which there is no special art." End quote. The art of being right is avowedly a work of satire, and Schopenhauer never published it. But I think it would be wrong-headed to suggest that the entire work is a farce, and that Schopenhauer therefore believes the opposite of what he writes here. In fact, much of what he argues, especially in the preliminary, accords strongly with his broader philosophy. The sense in which the work is satire is important to grasp, but we'll discuss that at the end of the video. First, I want to examine the arguments in the preliminary, that is, after a word from our sponsor. You can't really feel secure about your data unless you know for a fact that it hasn't been compromised. But when there's a data breach, it takes most companies an average of about 9 months to report that breach to the public. This is more common than you might think. Last year, Citigroup and JP Morgan Chase both had data breaches, and when Bank of America had a data breach recently, once again, the public didn't know about it for months. If being in the dark about your data being stolen sounds like something you want to avoid, then you should check out the sponsor for this video, Aura. Data brokers compile your private information and sell it to the highest bidder, all without your knowledge. Legally, they are supposed to remove it if you ask them, but they make it very hard to do. This is where Aura comes in. Aura will inform you if they find your data anywhere on the dark web, and will let you know quickly if anyone tries to use this information to try and get into your accounts. They will also do the hard work of removing your information from these data broker websites for you. Free credit monitoring after the fact, the kind of thing offered by other services. It's kind of like installing security cameras after your house was robbed. If you have Aura on your side, they'll be actively on the lookout to protect your data before anything happens. And in the worst case scenario, they offer up to $5 million in identity theft insurance. Their app provides so many features to keep you safe and informed about your data, and if you go right now to aura.com/essentialsalts, they'll even give you a free 14-day trial. Within that 14-day period, they can tell you if any of your personal data is exposed. You'll know about it before one of these companies are forced to notify you months later. So don't take any chances with your data. Don't let anyone take advantage of you because you were in the dark. Go to the sponsored link, get your free 14-day trial, and let Aura keep you in the know. And now back to the video. Schopenhauer goes back to the earliest thinkers who wrote about the relationship between truth and discourse, and ultimately takes a more radical view than Aristotle in distinguishing the pursuit of truth, which is the purview of logic, from the art of, quote, getting the best of a dispute, end quote, which is the purview of rhetoric. Aristotle was taught by Plato, who was taught by Socrates, and Socrates attempted to instruct people to lead them to the truth by means of the dialectic. In other words, in a dialogue between two sufficiently intelligent, self-aware, and honest interlocutors, one person can lead another through logical argumentation to see the truth. Perhaps to get someone to understand the implications of a position that they hold, which they have not considered. Perhaps to point out that two truth claims that they expound are actually in contradiction with one another. But fundamentally, this is the Socratic faith, that the truth can be revealed through dialogue. Accordingly, Plato drew a distinction between dialectic and rhetoric, arguing that there are multiple kinds of discourse that can occur. A speaker may simply attempt to persuade listeners to his own perspective, regardless of the logical truth, but this is rhetoric, it's mere flattery and deception. The Socratic dialogue, on the other hand, is anchored in the moral demand to yield to the truth when it has been made clear. Indeed, the term logos has the connotation in ancient Greek of revealing, uncovering, helping one to see what was hidden or unclear. As the philosopher Martin Heidegger puts it, quote, spoken communication, in what it says, makes manifest what it is talking about, and thus makes it accessible to another. Such is the structure of logos, end quote. In other words, the claim from Socrates onward is that logic can be expressed in speech, and therefore speech can be used to logically instruct. Aristotle accordingly preserves the distinction between rhetoric and dialectic, and even though he thinks about it much differently from Plato, untangling all of that is beyond the scope of this video. What's important for our purposes is that Schopenhauer argues against all of this. He writes, quote, I am of the opinion that a sharper distinction should be drawn between dialectic and logic than Aristotle has given us, that to logic we should assign objective truth as far as it is merely formal, and that dialectic should be confined to the art of gaining one's point, and contrarily that sophistic and eristic types of rhetoric should not be distinguished from dialectic in Aristotle's fashion, since the difference which he draws rests on objective and material truth. And in regard to what this is, we cannot attain any clear certainty before discussion, but we are compelled, with Pilate, to ask, what is truth? For truth is in the depths. It is easy to say that in every dispute we should have no other aim than the advancement of truth. But before the dispute, no one knows where it is, and through his opponent's arguments, and his own, a man is misled." End quote. By invoking the phrase of Diogenes Laertius, "truth is in the depths," Schopenhauer invokes the obscurity of the truth. It is his conviction that logic is the activity of the introspective individual intellect. It has no special art. And given that the human intellect is fallible, it may often be the case that two honest interlocutors could engage in a dispute while at the same time being misled as to what the truth is. We can't be certain that we know the truth before we engage in a discussion, and therefore, even if we hold to the value of truth, we may be uttering falsehoods. No matter how highly we praise the truth as the highest moral value and swear to uphold it, this does not safeguard us from being wrong. Therefore, we might convince other people to believe our falsehoods, not because we intend to deceive them. Rather, it might just be because we are arguing for a position we sincerely believe, but which was established by faulty logic. And supposing that we have established our own positions by unassailable correct reasoning, there is no guarantee that our interlocutor or the audience possesses the same caliber of logical acumen. As such, Schopenhauer argues that whether or not a given interlocutor in a dispute gains the upper hand has nothing to do with the logical strength of his position. False positions can gain the advantage if they are put forward in a more convincing manner, for example, by playing on the prejudices of the audience. And true positions, if they are not expressed in a convincing manner, will fail regardless of their truthfulness. Therefore, we must conclude that, in the arena of debate, even true positions require rhetoric, the art of persuasion, in order to be effective. This means that the standard by which one succeeds or fails in dialectic is not truth, but persuasion. The argument here is not that false claims are more likely to succeed. It is that the truth or falsity of the claim is unrelated to its success. Even our own convictions that our truth is the correct one can't provide the means of transcending this situation, however depressing we may find it, because we cannot ever be sure that we actually possess the truth. Not to speak of our interlocutor, who may be equally certain that we do not possess it. Only an omniscient being could ever possess that kind of absolute certainty, and that is certainly not the human condition. Quote, "Accordingly, in a dialectical contest, we must put objective truth aside, or rather we must regard it as an accidental circumstance, and look only to the defense of our own position and the refutation of our opponents. In following out the rules to this end, no respect should be paid to objective truth, because we usually do not know where the truth lies. As I have said, a man often does not himself know whether he is in the right or not. He often believes it and is mistaken. Both sides often believe it. Truth is in the depths. At the beginning of a contest, each man believes, as a rule, that right is on his side. In the course of it, both become doubtful, and the truth is not determined or confirmed until the close. Dialectic, then, need have nothing to do with truth, as little as the fencing master considers who is in the right when a dispute leads to a duel. Thrust and parry is the whole business. Dialectic is the art of intellectual fencing, and it is only when we so regard it that we can erect it into a branch of knowledge." End quote. What Schopenhauer has done here is to divorce the art of debate from the logos. Objective truth is to be laid aside, as he says, and the dialectic is to be understood purely as a series of tactics. Instruction can't enter into it, as we can't be certain which of us are truly qualified to instruct, as regards the objective truth. And while Schopenhauer's positions may seem disturbing to many of us when applied to, say, political or ethical debates, I would argue that his perspective as regards discourse is relatively uncontroversial when it comes to, for example, the practice of law, and even finds a corollary in the debates that take place in the empirical sciences. And it is rather telling that in these domains of human activity, which we consider to be of the highest possible importance, The law and scientific discovery, we not only allow for this kind of dialectic to take place, but even demand it. What I mean by this is that in a criminal trial, we've established a system in which there is both an advocate for the defense and a prosecutor, both of whom are expected to do the best possible job of presenting the evidence to support their case in a persuasive manner and framing the interpretation of the opposing evidence in a way that undermines the opposing case. In fact, if a defense attorney came to the logical conclusion that his client was probably guilty and decided not to provide a compelling defense, to intentionally undermine his own defense, this would be legal malpractice. We demand, in the legal context, two obstinate interlocutors who will frame everything in terms that help them gain the advantage. The analogy I would make to scientific debate is a bit looser, but I would put it this way. Those who argue for a novel or radical hypothesis expect to meet resistance from other scientists who will challenge that hypothesis. Even if on a personal or intuitive level they may agree with that hypothesis. The scientific method proceeds by falsification, and for it to succeed, we have to subject all claims to repeated and continual scrutiny. In other words, it seems that in these serious domains of debate, where the stakes are not first prize in a contest, but whether a defendant will spend 20 years of his life in prison, or whether or not we'll be able to cure cancer, we don't presume that a debate is productive because one or both sides possesses the truth already or thinks that they possess a truth already. It's not that either of the two sides already know the truth and that the other side therefore needs to be instructed. We expect them both to take up a stubborn position for the affirmative or the negative and to utilize every possible tactic to win, and we therefore expect them to be dishonest. When a defense attorney speaks on behalf of his client, he is being dishonest if we were to evaluate him by the standards of intellectual honesty that privilege, for example, good faith. But a lawyer necessarily argues in bad faith. He begins from the conclusion, for example, my client is innocent, and forces every position around that conclusion. He ignores or minimizes the disconfirming evidence, anything that contradicts his position, even if he thinks on a personal level that it might be true or compelling. And yes, I know that good faith is also a legal term, but I'm using it here in the sense of an intellectually honest argument. And so, to sum up Schopenhauer's position here, we might think of Machiavelli's infamous phrase, that wherever there are good arms, there will be good laws. Therefore, Machiavelli says, I will speak of the arms and not the laws. Schopenhauer is saying, wherever there are strong debate tactics, one will persuade others to believe that their position is the truth. Therefore, we can set aside the truth and simply speak of the tactics. And Schopenhauer directly references Machiavelli in a footnote, which also happens to encapsulate his approach wonderfully. Quote, Machiavelli recommends his prince to make use of every moment that his neighbor is weak in order to attack him, as otherwise his neighbor may do the same. If honor and fidelity prevailed in the world, it would be a different matter. But as these are qualities not to be expected, a man must not practice them himself, because he will meet with a bad return. It is just the same in a dispute. If I allow that my opponent is right as soon as he seems to be so, it is scarcely probable that he will do the same when the position is reversed. And as he acts wrongly, I am compelled to act wrongly too. It is easy to say that we must yield to truth without any prepossession in favor of our own statements, but we cannot assume that our opponent will do it, and therefore we cannot do it either. Nay, if I were to abandon the position on which I had previously bestowed much thought, as soon as it appeared that he was right, it might easily happen that I might be misled by a momentary impression and give up the truth in order to accept an error. End quote. The fundamental badness of human beings is an undertone to these musings in the preliminary, and this ought to be unsurprising if you're familiar with Schopenhauer's philosophical perspective. This is part of why I don't think it's sufficient to simply disregard the work as satire, even though it is satire, because Schopenhauer is pessimistic about mankind just as he is about life in general, and he remains consistent here. The thing about yielding to the truth when it presents itself is that this action requires one to be virtuous. We might well expect that people will accept the truth when it suits their advantage, but what about when the truth doesn't suit your advantage? Well, in that case, you're required to forgo what might benefit you in the name of the moral ideal of upholding the truth. Would we really expect this from the majority of people? Schopenhauer would say that we shouldn't, and while I don't usually base my positions on just so arguments or emotional appeals, I think there's a strong but intuitive case to be made that he's correct. I mean, just look at the world around you. Do you think that the average person is ready and willing to admit when they're wrong? What about when admitting that would jeopardize their sense of identity, or impugn their way of life, or personally disadvantage them? Schopenhauer elaborates on this. Quote, "If the reader asks how this is, I reply that it is simply the natural baseness of human nature. If human nature were not base but thoroughly honorable, we should in every debate have no other aim than the discovery of truth. We should not in the least care whether the truth proved to be in favor of the opinion which we had begun by expressing, or of the opinion of our adversary. That we should regard as a matter of no moment, or at any rate of very secondary consequence. But as things are, it is the main concern. Our innate vanity, which is particularly sensitive in reference to our intellectual powers, will not suffice us to allow that our first position was wrong and our adversary's right. The way out of this difficulty would be simply to take the trouble always to form a correct judgment. For this a man would have to think before he spoke. But with most men, innate vanity is accompanied by loquacity and innate dishonesty. They speak before they think, and even though they may afterwards perceive that they are wrong and that what they assert is false, they want it to seem the contrary." End quote. Again, is Schopenhauer's view pessimistic? Well, would you expect anything less? But is he wrong? That, I think, is rather hard to argue. Finally, as I've mentioned, I want to elaborate further as to how I think the satirical nature of this work should be understood. But to do this, we have to relate these claims, in the preliminary of The Art of Being Right, to Schopenhauer's broader philosophical project. Schopenhauer is a philosopher of the will who argued, taking influence from his German predecessor Immanuel Kant and the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, that the world we experience through the senses is only a represented world. He held that the beings, objects, and events that we perceive do not exist independently of our perceptions of them. The only reality behind these perceptions is the ceaseless and blindly striving will. Schopenhauer had a fundamentally negative view of existence, as characterized by the continuous arising of desire that never concludes in a state of satisfaction. In other words, he believed happiness, or fulfillment in life, to be impossible, and thought that what we called happiness was simply a temporary absence of suffering. Schopenhauer's philosophy therefore entails a rather cynical outlook as regards all striving, all ambition, indeed all human affairs. Accordingly, for Schopenhauer, the whole of history is really the same story of the will, playing out again and again in different forms. There are different casts of characters, different historical details, but it is never more than a repetition of the same drama, the vainglorious attempt at achieving happiness or satisfaction, either for oneself or for mankind. The idea that by striving, one will finally, quote-unquote, arrive, get somewhere, achieve progress. Schopenhauer writes, quote, "All those who postulate constructions about the world in motion, or as they call it, history, have not grasped the fundamental truth of philosophy. That, philosophically speaking, what really is the same at all times. The fools, however, believe that it will develop and one day arrive. Thus they regard the whirling world as they perceive it as the ultimate reality, and see its final meaning in a meager bliss on earth, which, even if cultivated evermore by men and favored by fate, will remain a hollow, deceptive, fickle, and sorry thing, of which nothing essentially better can ever come, through either constitutions, or legal codes, or steam engines, or telegraphs. A real philosophy of history ought to bear in mind what forever is, and never develops." End quote. In other words, Schopenhauer would roundly reject the idea of an arc of history bending towards justice, towards truth, or really towards anything. All such social and political activity is a revolving absurdity that can never accomplish its aims. One may agree or disagree with Schopenhauer on this point, but I think it is key to understanding his perspective and why he thinks about discourse the way he does. I think it's also helpful for understanding why our most rigorous forms of debate, for example, legal debate, are not understood through the lens that there is one side who possesses the truth while trying to instruct the other, in order for all to be led to that truth in the end. Whereas oftentimes, political and ethical debate is understood that way. The Schopenhauerian argument would be that in the political and ethical realms, we are misled by the notion that we possess a true or just ideal that needs to be realized in the world. The only obstacle to that ideal being realized is the fact that not everyone agrees with it. Not everyone possesses the truth that we do. If we could just convince enough people, perhaps we could make progress. This kind of thinking is a mistake for Schopenhauer because progress cannot be achieved. We think we can formulate a truly just state of human affairs and cause it to come into being. But these ideals concern this represented world, this suffering and striving world that can never be satisfied. Schopenhauer holds that if we really want to grasp the truth, we'll have to employ logic, not dialectic. But what is it that logic will reveal? What is the truth beyond the represented world? Quote, "In all those endless variations and turmoils, we have before us merely the one creature, essentially identical and unchangeable, busying itself with the very same things today and yesterday and tomorrow." End quote. The one creature, essentially identical and unchangeable, is the will. Those who recognize this truth, in Schopenhauer's estimation, are few indeed. We could count among them the likes of Gautama Buddha, for example. The Buddha realized that all phenomena are empty, unsatisfactory, and impermanent, and strived instead to cease incarnating into this world. Those who persist in the delusion that there is something of value to be found in the phenomenal existence will forever be dissatisfied and continue recreating these same dramas ad nauseum. And this is the sense in which I think we should understand Schopenhauer's attempt at satire in The Art of Being Right. He makes it clear that debates are won by dialectical tactics and not logic. That means if one wants to win debates, look better in front of an audience, or win a political office, one needs these tactics and must understand them as a fencing master understands his art, as amoral and unconcerned with the objective truth. Is this, therefore, a glorification of those tactics? Well, only if we believe that winning debates, holding political offices, or looking good in front of an audience are worthwhile goals. But from Schopenhauer's perspective, none of these are worthwhile goals. At best, they are a distraction from the only possible goal for one who knows the truth, the negation of the will, the escape from the samsaric wheel of desire and dissatisfaction. At worst, these dialectical tactics perpetuate the misapprehension that happiness, justice, or progress can be achieved. In my view, what Schopenhauer has done is reveal just how ugly the entire art of debate really is. This treatise is, in effect, a warning to the prospective truth seeker not to be mistaken about where the truth is to be found. In so many words, Schopenhauer says, if you really want to get involved in this dialectics business, fine. But here is what you're getting into. You're going to have to argue in bad faith, persist in your point even when you've been disproven, hold the techniques of persuasion above objectivity or reason. You may not like it, but these are the rules of the game. So, what are those rules? Well, the actual body of the text involves these 38 tactics for winning debates, and it's striking how familiar many of these will seem when we go over them. It's almost as if Schopenhauer wrote a guide to arguing online before the internet was even invented. But we're going to save that for another episode of the Übermodernism series. Join me then for the sequel to this episode, in which we'll consider a selection of my favorite bad faith tactics listed by Schopenhauer in The Art of Being Right. But for now, thank you for joining me. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.